So the first question is who you are and how you got involved in this project.
Yeah, I'm Nicole King. I'm a professor of American Studies at UMBC, and I study place, power, economic development, and do cultural documentation projects in Baltimore with the Baltimore Traces Project. It looks at Baltimore neighborhoods. It's called Baltimore Traces Communities in Transition. It looks at how Baltimore neighborhoods change over time and then tries to center what residents, people who live and work in the neighborhoods, how they feel about those changes on the ground. So I started teaching out of the Lyon Brothers building, which is in the Hollins Market area, and became really interested first in the public market and the redevelopment of Hollins Market, and then just the redevelopment of this entire area, because it really is related to the movement of the biopark, private public University of Maryland biopark project across Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard into Poppleton and Hollins Market area, and it changed the area radically from its history in the 19th century. So we started working on projects with Curtis Eady II, who works for the Southwest Partnership. The first one was a journey through Hollins, about Hollins Market. The second one was a walk down West Baltimore Street, about the redevelopment of West Baltimore Street, which was kind of the racial dividing line between many of the neighborhoods historically, and a major commercial thoroughfare. And then the most recent one that we're working on now is called A Place Called Poppleton, that looks at the Poppleton neighborhood and kind of the redevelopment of that area, going way back to kind of slum clearance projects in the early 20th century up until the 21st century, where it's being kind of completely redeveloped with a new project called Center West.
And now, what are you doing helping the community?
Well, I think what we're doing really is trying to kind of amplify the voices of the people who live and work in the area, specifically people who are being displaced or relocated due to the development. Because a lot of times the news coverage, the media coverage focuses on the development, the changes, all the positive things coming to the neighborhood. And sometimes the everyday residents who are being most affected by those changes, we don't hear from them as much. So we really wanted to talk to people on the ground, see what they were thinking and what they were feeling. And then, the project kind of moved in certain directions towards one block in the development project where residents were kind of fighting against displacement on the Edie and Sarah Ann Street block. And we kind of focused on that block while also looking at the larger kind of history, the Black history of Poppleton, which is kind of a history that's overlooked in preservation, and the history of Southwest Baltimore. It's often, we have the B&O Railroad Museum, we have the Irish Railroad Workers Museum, so it's kind of white ethnic history that's centered in preservation and history of this area. And we really wanted to look at the stories of public housing in the Poe Homes, which is the city's first public housing complex, but also the residents who lived in Poppleton and who kind of persevered and preserved the neighborhood through many different things, such as road construction, disinvestment, development that kind of freezes a neighborhood for a period of time. So we were really interested in those stories, which are often difficult stories for people to talk about, losing your home or having your neighborhood completely change and no one asks you, what do you want to see here? So that's really what we've been trying to do over the past kind of year and a half, is collect those stories and work with people and really amplify those voices. And in that process, you become friends with folks. We've been working very closely with people who are, being displaced due to eminent domain, which is the process of where the state can take private property for a public use. And it's used oftentimes in cities like Baltimore, historic cities experiencing deindustrialization or depopulation, and a decline in the tax income base. Eminent domain is used to kind of clear properties and offer them for outside developers to come and kind of re-envision a neighborhood. And that's kind of what's happened somewhat here in Poppleton.
Okay. Now what I'm going to ask you is if you can just summarize the development project since the beginning until now. Yes.
Okay. All right, that's going to be, so the development project has been a long project, and to talk about it, it kind of began with a request for proposals in 2004. But you have to go back a little bit in time to really get the context of the area and all the kind of federal dollars that have been put into Poppleton to try and revitalize the neighborhood, beginning with kind of public housing with Poe Homes in 1940, and that used like slum clearance models. Then you have kind of the rise of the high rises, public housing in the 1950s through the 1990s, where there's like high density public housing in this area. And a part of that, also the area became part of an urban renewal zone in 1975. And that was a project, again, where federal funds are put into an area to kind of rethink and reclaim places, mostly places where Black people have lived, right? And that disinvestment. So those are the things that kind of preceded the development project. A lot of public, especially federally funded projects were kind of placed in Poppleton, from LBJ's, kind of Model Cities program, to the more recent Clinton era Empowerment Zone project, which I think most directly relates to what we're seeing going on now in Poppleton. And the Empowerment Zone project was 5 different cities. Baltimore was one of 5. They got $100 million of federal funds, and then the city and other private entities put in another like $500 to $800 million. So it was hundreds of millions of dollars invested in Baltimore, many parts of the city, and one of those was Poppleton. So they built village centers, they tried to talk to people, come up with a plan, and then one of the major things that came out of that project of the 1990s was in 2004 when the biopark kind of moved across. That's the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the professional campuses in the west side of downtown. The biopark, which is a public-private research park, kind of moved across Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, which was a road built in 1982 that kind of separated this area from the west side of downtown. Now, road construction is a major issue. We also have the Highway to Nowhere, which was also constructed and finished in 1975, but that was a long process, and that cut off Black communities, middle-class communities in Poppleton, Harlem Park, which is on the other side of the Highway to Nowhere today. So all of these things kind of culminated in 2004 when the biopark arrived, and working off of that kind of university money and investment, the city took 526 properties in Poppleton. They owned 300 and something of those properties, but 169 they needed to take by eminent domain. And out of those, 130 were occupied. So that is 130 people's homes were kind of offered as part of this large kind of plot of land. It's 13.8 acres to developers. So many different developers bid on the project, and the one that ended up was La Cité, which is a development company out of New York City led by the Bythewood family. So that began in 2004, and then the city essentially began the process of using eminent domain, different public funds to relocate residents. And that went on for many, many years, and the development kind of paused. 2008, of course, was the kind of pinnacle of the global housing market crash. So the development just kind of moved along slowly, and people in Poppleton kind of slowly persevered and continued to build community. And then, by 2012, the city tried to get out of this development project. The developer sued to keep the right to develop all of these areas. And then 3 years later, the city had a change of heart and gave the developer a $58 million TIF, which is tax increment funding, which was to fund the infrastructure for this development. So then by 2017, a plan for 2 luxury apartment buildings, and those had some problems being built. There were some water issues, but they eventually opened in 2019, and the Center West apartment buildings were built. And then that brings us to 2020, when there started to be another wave of displacing residents who were in kind of the later phase. And those were residents, the Edie family, the McFadden family, people that we've talked to and interviewed, as well as in March of 2021, the Sarah Ann Street residents on these historic row homes that were built in 1880s in this area. So it kind of brings us up to where we are today, when residents again are being displaced for this development, though no one really knows what's moving forward with it. And I think no resident of Poppleton is against development. I think what they're against is development with displacement, and what they're for is community-led development, especially with the immense amount of public funds that has been invested in this development, that it's not just a private developer coming in with his or her money doing a project. That project is dependent upon taxpayer dollars. And also the large thing of the relocation of residents on one side of West Baltimore Street, where those residents are predominantly black. We're standing on the other side of West Baltimore Street in what was called Poppleton South, which is now referred to as Holland's Market or Holland's Roundhouse neighborhood. And a lot of the funds were used to homestead here, so to invest in homes on this side of West Baltimore Street and to essentially buy up and tear down and demolish homes that were exactly the same on that side of the street. So there's a little bit of an outdated model of development here on numerous ways. Number one, the main one is when you take a bunch of properties where 130 families live and you say, we're going to recreate this. It's a settler colonial vision, right, that the United States is based on. Eminent domain law is based on that same vision of not seeing the people who are already on the land. May they be indigenous people, may they be legacy residents who are black or brown in cities like Baltimore. But that's the kind of model of development, I think, that causes harm in communities that many scholars have kind of written about. It also, I think Lawrence Brown, in his book on the black butterfly, looks at and offers a way to stop this kind of bad development with displacement, and talks about using an equity lens that not only acknowledges the historical trauma done to black neighborhoods like Poppleton, but also, number two, comes up with a plan to stop it, to stop doing historical, trauma to black neighborhoods and to invest in them and give people, and the people that we've talked to, they know what they want, they know what they need, they know what they deserve. They need to be asked, they need to be invested in. And so that's a different model that we're trying to move towards, I think, in Baltimore. In this development, there could be a great potential for it to shift and to center residents to stop displacement right now, and to work together to have a more kind of community-led development project. But that's me being optimistic. I don't know if that'll happen, but that's what we're fighting for, what should happen. I think what the research that I'm doing with my students is focused on is hearing from people and then amplifying those voices. And that means not just in the classroom. We do this through films. We do this through zines that we take out to the community. We do this in various ways to work with and to just get the stories out. And also it's people own their own stories, and that's a really important part of, I think, what we're doing and what I'm doing working with students is to learn to listen, right? To learn to listen to the voices of people on the ground who are being affected by this development.
So, there are two things I want you to develop with the floor. The first one is, what's the difference between the original idea of the project and what's going to happen?
Okay.
Multiplication and deceive.
Okay, great. Totally. All right. So what happened with the beginning of this project and how it was envisioned and how it is actually being executed, I think, is really important. And there's two central issues. Number one is preservation, because these large development projects they kind of bring Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So these are historic neighborhoods that date, Poppleton is named after Thomas Poppleton, who made the original maps of Baltimore City and laid out the streets and alleys in the 1830s. So this is a historic neighborhood. So the development originally had preservation kind of ingrained in the original development agreement. And what me and my students have come to find out, looking for, okay, this development says there's going to be the Sarah Ann Street alley homes, these historic homes owned by black people since, the 1870s, owned by black women since the 1870s, are supposed to be preserved in this, in 2006 when the development is signed. But it's 2021 and this has not happened. So preservation is one key thing. And also we want to be able to revisit what's being preserved in 2021. It's been 15 years and what's historic changes. And also centering kind of equity and the voices and the structures that represent the important history of Black home ownership in this neighborhood, when people couldn't have access to traditional capital because of redlining, other kind of racist banking practices. So that's one key thing. And the other key thing is tied to that preservation, and what we're trying to preserve, which is the homes of that history, is home ownership. This original development plan was supposed to bring a large amount of home ownership. There's still homes that were not torn down or were outside the development of small row homes, right? Like Poe Homes, the public housing complex. These are small row homes. That's Baltimore's character. That is what Baltimore's about. The original urban renewal plan had the top two objectives are, one, to preserve the character, the historic and architectural character of Poppleton. And number two is to provide home ownership for a wide range of affordable, from to have what they would call like a mixed neighborhood, where you're having people live next door to one another of different types of classes. And this has always been something historically in Southwest Baltimore. That's why we have the small alley houses and then the large 3-story brick row homes, is because the people who were managers at the B&O Railroad lived next to the people who were workers, lived next to the people who worked in their homes, and communities were integrated. But I think it's a really important thing that I tell my students. These communities were integrated in many ways by class and also by race and by ethnicity, because a huge amount of immigrant populations came to this area, as well as Black people, a lot of them migrating from the South. And they lived together here. We instituted policies in the mid-20th century to segregate. We instituted policies to separate, to build highways that decimated Black neighborhoods, and we invested in white neighborhoods. So we created this, and therefore that to me is hopeful that we can undo this kind of historical trauma that we've done to Black neighborhoods, and it'll benefit the entire city of Baltimore. Which I think is really important, that we center preservation, we center home ownership in developments moving forward. Because if you talk to the Edie family, if you talk to the McFadden family, owning a home is about investing in the next generation, something that you can pass on to your kids and your grandkids. This is something we as white people have had. Inheritance is something that we find usual because the system has worked for us, not against us. So what we're trying to do is to center racial equity and say the system must work for the people it has left outside. That we need to stop doing that kind of practices and build communities that are open to all races to live and to be able to build this intergenerational sense of wealth in Baltimore City.
You talked about that before, but I want to ask if you consider what's the mayor has here with this house a kind of violence against the Afro-American community.
Yes. So, you're talking about the mayor specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I think is, if we're talking about the current mayor we have, Mayor Brandon Scott, he's inherited this project, and this project has been so slow to bring development to the area, and it's a part of that kind of settler colonial vision that it was based on from the beginning. But it's also this part of slow violence of development, that when you slowly freeze a neighborhood over time, disinvestment happens, people persevere, and then when people are ready to invest the money, those people are pushed out of the neighborhood. So Mayor Scott has come up with, we had the 2020 census, which again did not look good for Baltimore. Lots of people were leaving the city again. And he came out with a plan for 2030 to really invest in our Black and brown legacy residents in this city, because that's who's been leaving the city. And Mayor Scott put out a statement that he wants to center equitable development and leave no corner of Baltimore City behind. And I feel like we need to continue to call him on that, because this development project is a corner of Baltimore City. The Edie House, the Sarah Ann Street homes, they are literally on the highway to nowhere. Where the mayor stood with tons of politicians in May and said, we want to repair the damage that we've done. And again, going back to Lawrence Brown's equity lens, then you have to stop doing that damage. And stop doing that damage means preserving the Edie home, allowing that family to stay in their home, allowing the Sarah Ann Street residents to stay in those homes, allowing people who've been displaced to the first right to return to this area when it is developed. And all of these things are kind of embedded in the development plan, but they're rarely actually actualized. And really the question is, because of how Baltimore is set up, the mayor has a great deal of power. The question isn't if he could do it, it's does he have the political will to do it, to stand up for a family, stand up for the Edie family, to stand up for Carolyn Shoemaker, Mr. Bobby, the other people at the Sarah Ann Street homes, and say, we're going to invest in you. It's going to be difficult. Some people might make less money, but those people are pretty wealthy to begin with. So I think that's an important thing to call on the mayor to really put his money where his mouth is, or to use more cliches, to not just talk the talk but walk the walk. Politicians often say nice things, but what it really comes down to is actually doing those things. The mayor, Mayor Scott, ran on defunding the police, and then he increased the police budget by $28 million. Mayor Scott ran on equitable development, but Mayor Scott, it's the case with the Edie family. It's the mayor and the city council of Baltimore versus Curtis Edie et al. So it is the mayor and the city council that is displacing this family from their home, using the eminent domain to take their home for this development. It doesn't have to happen. There's a home right over there of a woman named Darlene who fought against the biopark to preserve her home. She was allowed to stay. We can let people stay, we can have development, and we can have preservation if the politicians have the political will to really listen to people and then to take action to support them. Even if it's just one family on the corner of the highway to nowhere, that family matters. Black neighborhoods matter. That's really an important, this is a predominantly black city, so I think those are important things for the mayor to kind of reckon with.
And before that mayor, how do you think the government of Baltimore has treated this neighborhood?
Yeah. Well, I think the politicians in Baltimore City have, because of this decrease in tax base, have been so focused on bringing these outside developers. They think development will save us. I don't think that is necessarily true. We need development, but the residents of the city are investing in the residents of the city, the legacy residents who have stayed and persevered, not the ones who left and moved to the county when going got tough here. So we're always focused from a political perspective in the city with bringing in new people, and that's great, and we need to do that, but you have to invest in the core of the people who stayed, whether they stayed by choice or by not. They're here. They have preserved these neighborhoods. The city didn't preserve the Sarah Ann Street row homes. The residents there did. The Edie family did. Communities working together and forming like families on blocks did. They're doing the work to preserve Baltimore City, and that work is often erased if you have the potential to bring an outside developer in to kind of redo a neighborhood.
Right. And yes, to finish this part,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm going to ask you about like the historical part.
Mm-hmm.
To finish this, I want you to tell us about this experience that you had
Mm-hmm.
when with your husband to see the just new flats, apartments. Because I want you to show how this sentence that everybody is welcome there, everybody has a place in Baltimore. It's true.
Right. So back in 2019, I think it's 2019. Yeah, back in 2019, my husband and I went to the International Edgar Allan Poe Festival, which is located in the Poe Park, which the Center West luxury apartment developments are right next to Poe Home, the city's oldest public housing complex. So there's tensions, of course, there. The apartments, for good, have 20% affordable housing. So they're 80% market rate, 20% affordable. So they'd had a lot of problems in getting the development open. In 2019, we went on a tour of the apartment buildings. And for context, we live in an apartment building, which is a historic building that was rehabbed in the 1980s, just on the other side of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in the Seton Hill, Mount Vernon neighborhood. So we went to tour these new apartments, which are quite expensive. Started at $1,400 for a studio and go up to $3,000 for a 3-bedroom, which is far more than we pay for our 3-bedroom in the middle of the west side of downtown. So the pricing of these apartments seemed a bit high for the neighborhood, because what the development does in the 20% affordable is based on AMI, the area medium income, which includes Towson, includes parts of Howard County and Baltimore County, includes the metro area. So that is around $90,000. But if you look at the actual median income of people who live in Poppleton, that is, below $40,000 a year. It's somewhere like $24,000 a year in that specific neighborhood. So if you go and you look at this luxury apartment building in the middle of public housing, it is a little off. Also, touring the buildings, they have, granite. They have lovely on the inside. The outside's a kind of different ball game. It doesn't really fit the historical character of the neighborhood, as again the early kind of development plans said that it should. And not everything has to be historic, right? I think one of the main issues with this apartment building is it's kind of prefab. It doesn't fit the context of the area. But the future plans that we've been able to find from 2019 just show more luxury apartment buildings with even higher densities. These apartment buildings have 262 units. The plan for the Edie block and the connecting block are to have 998 units of housing, which would mean high rises. The Lexington Terrace high rises, which was 6 buildings, like 12 stories tall, they had 776 units of housing. So this is an immensely high density for Baltimore, even for downtown Baltimore, that is being planned. And so the issue is not one apartment building, but what happens to a neighborhood of brick row homes when you create many large high-rise apartment buildings, because again, in the past with Lexington Terraces and the high-rises there, that didn't really go well. So neighbors who've been here for a long period of time are kind of concerned about the character of the neighborhood, and does this apartment building fit with that character? So.
And now, yes, we are going to talk about the historic point of view.
Mm-hmm.
This is the last part of our interview. So I want to ask you, I think that you mentioned that, I want if you could explain a little more, was the way, la autopista en ninguna parte, the way to anywhere, or
The
highway to nowhere. Yes.
Oh, the highway to nowhere.
Sorry.
All right. So the highway to nowhere came out of a plan in the 1940s, which was based off of a plan developed by Robert Moses, who was from New York City, power broker, completely redeveloped New York City and many other cities. And he had that very settler colonial vision for development, where it's clear everything out, put new things in. So Robert Moses developed this plan for Baltimore City, which was interstates kind of coming through the city. It was very controversial. It was going to tear down neighborhoods like Federal Hill, historic neighborhoods in East Baltimore, and people fought back against highway construction as demolition. So the highway to nowhere was the only part that was built, and it's like 1.4 miles. It's not even a mile and a half of highway that essentially you're on. It's called the Franklin Mulberry Expressway. So you get on it and you get back off on the same exact road you got back on. So it is completely useless. And what it did was displace 1,500 people. Many homes, many businesses, far many than in the uprisings or riots of 1968 when people rose up, set fire to the city. And we often talk about that historically, but the damage was far worse with the highway to nowhere. And it was really only built separating middle-class black neighborhoods in West Baltimore. The more white ethnic neighborhoods were able to fight against it. And I want us to be sure to recognize that the residents of Poppleton, that the residents of Harlem Park fought the highway as well. They just didn't have the social and political capital at that point to fight as effectively as other white neighborhoods in Baltimore City. So it stands as this kind of this gash, this wound in the city, that every time this weekend I went to Parity Homes, which is a developer named Bree Jones, who is doing development without displacement on the 500 block of North Carrollton Street, which is literally on the other side of the highway to nowhere from the Edie home. And the mayor was there, you know, Antonio Hayes, our senator, our comptroller, John Bullock, the councilman for this area. Everyone was there to support this development without displacement on the other side of highway to nowhere. And we're just asking them to walk across to the 300 block of North Carrollton Avenue and also be invested in that same rhetoric of development without displacement. And I think, you know, if we go back to May, when Brandon Scott, the mayor, and different politicians and sat on the highway to nowhere and called for repair to that damage, they did so because of the forthcoming, we hope, maybe, Biden infrastructure plan that would invest millions, billions of dollars in infrastructure in cities like Baltimore. So again, it's more federal money determining the fate of neighborhoods, which is fine to have infrastructure projects and things of that nature. But also, at the same time the mayor was sitting on the highway to nowhere talking about repairing the damage, he was displacing a black family from their home along the highway to nowhere. And you can't do both. You can't do both because it's contradictory and it's hypocritical. You have to invest in development without displacement for all corners of the city, to use the mayor's own language.
So we see that in 60 years, things
Yeah, things. That is one of the issues that I have in Baltimore. Is we keep doing the same things and expecting different results. In Baltimore, we keep having the same policies of development that are too big rather than incremental and small and invested in communities and community led. And again, it's a lot easier to bring an outside developer in than it is. It's difficult to work with people on the ground. Not like a community sees everything from the same perspective. But those tensions and those are things that's what makes a neighborhood, right? That's what makes a community. Community is not everyone getting along all the time and singing kumbaya. A community is people working with one another through difference and disagreement to create the best possible neighborhood for the most people to be able to live and work and have and build lives there. And that's hard work, right? And it's not about just bringing someone outside to look at the city like a video game, like it's Sim City, and doing some AutoCAD and designing a road on top of the city or designing a development on top of the city. That's top-down development. We need bottom-up development that talks to people on the ground.
Last question regarding the historical part.
Mm-hmm.
What is asking the historical committee?
Mm-hmm.
Why and until now, what here?
What was the question
Well,
again, Maria? Sorry.
This is like, what are you doing in the historical committee?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you can talk about the historical houses that are in the neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
and then what are you asking for?
Oh, okay.
Why? What do you want to preserve?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you have been heard or if you are ignoring.
Okay, excellent, gotcha. So what we're doing, because the development agreement, the land disposition and development agreement, had this memorandum of agreement based on preservation that has not been addressed in 15 years. What we're working with residents to do is to take that into our own hands, right? To do our own research, to preserve the area that is historic. And what that means is to preserve the homes with the people in it. So what we're doing is we're working on a CHAP, the city's historical and architectural preservation arm, a local history district. And we're calling it tentatively now Black Home Ownership in Old Poppleton, because it would preserve the row of homes from the Edie homes on 300 North Carrollton Avenue through the 1100 block of Sarah Ann Street. So it both the 3-story brick row homes that are iconic of Baltimore, and the Edie home was built in 1871. It also, has this history of, kind of white people who built it. One of them ones who lived in it fought in the Civil War, is a noted historian. But then the shift happened in 1928. The first black family purchased the Edie home in 1928, and it has been owned by black families, two of them, the Sewells, and then the Edie Waugh, Sonia's father, Donald Waugh, bought the home in 1992. So this home has been owned by black families since 1928, and that is a great testament to the history and the resiliency of black Baltimoreans over time. Same thing with Sarah Ann Street alley homes that were built in 1870s. Again, built by white wealthy people connected to Johns Hopkins family, but offered for home ownership to black people in Poppleton. One of the first homeowners with Catherine Kennedy, and she bought her home in 1874. A black woman from North Carolina who was a widow with a small child, purchased this home and then used that capital and kind of mortgaged it to build wealth, to build that wealth that she then passed on. And that is a tremendous history. It's an overlooked history. The history of black home ownership in the city dating to the 19th century on this block is what we're trying to preserve. And it's not just the character in the buildings, it's the buildings with the people in them, because buildings only matter because people build them, inhabit them, and give them meaning. That's what makes buildings homes, right? Instead of just being structures. And that's the meaning that people see in Poppleton, long-term neighbors. They're not asking to preserve the entire area because it's gone. It's too late to do that. No one was asking that from the beginning. They're asking to preserve some of the character of the neighborhood, and that character represents this rich history of black Baltimoreans persevering despite road construction, despite disinvestment, despite redlining and racist lending practices, and building the city. So I think that is the history. When you look around at these historic homes, they matter because people gave them meaning, and that's the thing that we want to preserve. That's the history that we're interested in.
The last question, and it's just if you know anything about it, because I want to interview another person for that, because I know it's not. It's about La Fite. What do you think about La Fite as the company, and what do you think about how this project is being financed?
Right. So La Cité is a company, didn't have a long development history, and it really worked with a lot of kind of black elites from New York City and Baltimore. So it kind of began with the Susan Taylor, who was the Essence editor of Essence magazine, good friends with Sheila Dixon, who was the city council president and later mayor of Baltimore City. So Dan Bythewood was kind of connected with a lot of black elite investors, including Malik Yoba, who was just on the news with Dan, who's an actor, a famous actor who also invested in La Cité. So this is, kind of black wealth and black excellence, which is a wonderful thing. This development, La Cité, was the first black developer to get a TIF. And whether you like TIFs or not, we've given them to white developers historically, so it makes sense that we should invest in black developers. I think that is an important aspect. But the only thing is to get black elite developers also to not, ascribe this like settler colonial vision, and to see the working class people here on the ground as well, and to be able to communicate and work with them. La Cité did it, putting 20% affordable housing in their apartments. They could do more. They could do more to work with neighbors on the ground who are working class, and to keep this a neighborhood for the community, for working class, middle class, and upper class professionals to live together in the city, as folks have in Southwest Baltimore historically for hundreds of years.
So, and now I think you answered all my questions, so if you want to add anything else, or if you want to ask
Anything else? Yeah. I kind of have my spiel.
You're good. You're on a roll.
you did great, really.
It is great.